Welcome back. You're watching Political Exchange. I'm Karima Brown, and my guests are Professor Gilbert Gadiagala, who heads up the School of International Affairs at Wits University, and SADC editor for Southern Africa Report, Vugani Mde. Just before the break, we were talking about the fact that Angola is Southern or Africa's second largest oil producer. It's a very resource-rich country, Professor, but its people are very poor. The chasm between the very rich and the very poor continues to widen. Now we know that there's been peace in Angola and there's been some dividend toward that peace. Is the MPLA doing enough to close this inequality gap to prevent the kind of instability that we've seen in other African countries?
That has been the biggest disappointment about Angola, in that despite the riches, 60% of the people are still very poor, earning $2, under $2 a day. And that's not a good record for a country that came out of the Civil War, with a lot of expectations that economic reconstruction was going to be on the top of the agenda. So the issue of how to address these inequalities has been a burning issue, and the MPLA has actually made some progress in putting up projects, the big housing projects, the reconstruction program through the Chinese assistance and so on. So there are things that have been, I think they have been put in place. The only problem is that they are not sufficient. And I think the bigger worry is the levels of corruption and I think abuse of institutions by the MPLA. And the very character of we don't really care that much. And it's a troubling component because the peace dividend has actually not been realized. And there is need maybe to come back after this election to the whole agenda on how do we actually begin to put up programs, economic programs that are actually going to reduce the differences between the rich and poor. And most of the discontent now is actually coming out of that very economic dimension. I think the MPLA has been able to buy political peace, but as long as these inequalities continue, there's going to be a lot of pressure on the government, in fact, to begin to address economic issues. And I think so between now and the next elections, if there's no clear-cut program on reducing corruption, building social services, more than what they are doing today, I think Angola will be in trouble.
Vugani, we know, for example, that Angola has an extraction-based economy. At the recent SADC summit, the infrastructure rollout plan was given the go-ahead. And there's the belief, certainly from the leaders' side, that by creating these regional hubs, linking up countries, so that you will have faster traction in terms of economic growth. You'd have a spurt in the growing of middle classes in places like Angola. Is that a possibility, given the fact that you have the MPLA with its hands on the lever so firmly? Is that process something that needs to be opened up, that needs to be liberalized?
Part of the problem, of course, is that the MPLA and Angola has come to the game of social reconstruction late. It has to be remembered that Angola was in a state of war from 1975 until 1992. The war formally ended in 1992, but didn't really end, and only really ended in the early 2000s with the death of Jonas Savimbi. And so the MPLA has had 10 to 12 years of attempting to socially reconstruct Angola, to close these gaps that you were talking about. And one of the key issues is infrastructure construction. And when it comes to the building and rebuilding of Angola's infrastructure, the MPLA has invested huge amounts of money into doing it, and they have invited regional partners such as South Africa and South African companies to come and participate in and of course the Chinese, as the professor has mentioned. One of the key gaps in Angola and in Southern Africa across the board is the absence of economic linkages between the various economic units. And countries operate as isolated economic units. And SADC has identified this problem as a key challenge to economic integration and growth. It still remains to be seen, obviously, whether or not Southern African leaders and their ambitious plans will succeed. But they are putting the plans in place, and they are putting money where the plans are. They have pledged up to as much as $500 billion over the next few years for simply just for infrastructure construction across the region.
Professor, earlier on, Vugani spoke about the similarities between the MPLA and the African National Congress in terms of its internal politics. We know that under President Jacob Zuma, relations between South Africa and Angola have become less frosty than they were, let's say, under the presidency of Thabo Mbeki. Certainly the two countries have signed many agreements around economic development. The relationship between South Africa and Angola, as it stands now, is it a healthy one? Does it speak to the kind of needs, the issues that we spoke about, reducing inequality, which plagues Angola, which plagues South Africa, the issue of joblessness, the issue of, poverty? How does that relationship take us towards addressing those fundamental challenges in both societies?
Bilateral relations have warmed up considerably since Jacob Zuma came to power, and I think the explanation was simple, that the Mbeki regime wasn't as warm to Dos Santos as Jacob Zuma, and so it's inevitable that South Africa should build strong bilateral relations with Angola, because there's a lot to gain from both, especially the Angolans wanting a lot of support for infrastructure and so on, and the South African economy is very sufficiently strong, and therefore the Angolans can actually learn a lot from South Africa, and that's why the relationship are as strong as they are today. The big issue to raise, however, is that Angola is part of a larger SADC, and SADC has a lot of principles, norms, and that guide even things like elections and so on. And so one would expect that Angola should actually be much more aligned to the practices and the principles within the larger SADC, especially on things like how to run an election, how independent the Electoral Commission should be. So SADC has these principles, and Angola has always remained outside some of those strictures of SADC. And that, to me, is a major concern, rather than the bilateral South Africa-Angola relations. So the more Angola actually lives up to the expectations about good governance and so on that are embedded within SADC frameworks, they're much better, because then we are acknowledging the fact that Angola really belongs to Southern Africa, and she can do things differently.
This idea that Angola can buck the trend in the region and still retain leadership of SADC, as it is in fact doing right now. It occupies the chair, with South Africa occupying the Troika chair. To what extent is that sending a message that the democratization program in Southern Africa is going to have limitations? We look at places like Namibia, we look at Zimbabwe, where you have very close political processes with very dominating political parties that tend to be able to interfere in the way in which elective processes, play itself out. Where does this take SADC and democratization in the long run, Vugani?
It's a key challenge for SADC going forward. And I'm not even sure that Angola is the worst example of this democracy deficit that SADC, by and large, still suffers from. You have the last absolute monarch in sub-Saharan Africa right here in SADC. You still have the intractable Zimbabwe issue, where President Robert Mugabe's government is still at loggerheads with history and the process and necessity for change. Angola obviously would be the third key challenge for SADC democratization, but it is by no means the worst. Going forward, it's an issue that's ultimately going to be resolved not by SADC leaders, but by SADC's people on the ground. Citizens will have to stand up to their leaders and say, this is how we want to be governed. That is how you entrench and grow democracy, not through SADC summits.
Professor, the question of democracy vis-a-vis development is a problem or a challenge that faces not just Southern Africa but the whole world. We know that many developing countries who do very well are in fact commander societies. They are top-down societies. We've seen the kind of infrastructure that the Angolans were able to lay out via the Chinese with a fairly closed society. This push to fast-track the economies of the continent, can it coexist, and will the world's investors, if you like, allow a democracy deficit as a trade-off for the kind of economic advantages that one would be able to extract from countries like Angola and even a place like Mozambique where we've just discovered gas?
You know, the balance between democracy and development is, I mean, the historical story is that you can trade off one to the other. I mean, if you're doing really good development issues and you need more time to build democracy, the people really can understand. I mean, if there is a general national consensus that we can postpone the discussions about democracy as we focus on development, well and good. I mean, as long as there is a national agenda for development. There is an agenda for reducing these stark inequalities. I think Angola is a very good example. I think after the war, everybody thought, you know, development was now going to be the #1 priority. And you can argue that, in fact, maybe it is, because they have put up, as I said, some platforms on
but it happens very much under the control of the MPLA.
Yeah, it does happen under the control of the MPLA. But the frustration in Angola now is that people are now not seeing the peace dividend, actually, because development was supposed to, I mean, this is a very rich country with a very small population. So one could argue that what they have done so far is not a very stellar record if we want to judge them on their developmental mandate. And then they are lagging on their democracy mandate because the MPLA is still very much in control. So the question, therefore, how do we return to a debate where we can say development is important, and Angolans can use their resources actually to create an equitable society over the long run. It's not going to happen in 20 years. But there should be a very clear agenda on how they are going to reduce inequalities, how they are going to reduce corruption and so on, how they are going to run a clean government. I think that's to be expected.
Gentlemen, unfortunately, we've run out of time. That is where we have to leave it. That's it for tonight's edition of Political Exchange. I'm Karima Brown. Goodbye.